In the early light of dawn, as a subtle glow crept over the ancient Vatican rooftops, Pope Leo XIV stood alone in one of the apostolic palace corridors, feeling the gravitas of a decision that had been taking shape for weeks. The hallway was silent, punctuated only by the distant shuffling of Swiss guards preparing for their morning watch. But within the Pope's heart, a storm of emotions was stirring. Hope, uncertainty, and the persistent ache that comes when two irreconcilable visions of the Church collide. He took a deep breath, thinking about the meeting he had witnessed the previous day, replaying each word exchanged between two cardinals he held in high regard: Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle and Cardinal Robert Sarah. Their clash had cut to the very core of what it meant for the Church to combine truth and mercy, orthodoxy and compassion. And now, in a few hours, he would have to finalize his response. For a moment, Pope Leo XIV recalled how he had arrived at this position. Once an unassuming bishop known for careful theological insight, he had been propelled into the papacy by a conclave that sought a balance between modern pastoral outreach and traditional Catholic teaching. As he gazed out a tall window that overlooked the city of Rome, he whispered in earnest prayer, "Guide me to the soul of the Church, Lord, even if it breaks my heart." He could still see the solemn expressions of the cardinals in the Sala Clementina, that ornate hall where discussions on the pastoral future of the Church had abruptly shifted from cordial debate to a confrontation heavy with undertones of pain and frustration. The memory made him feel weary. He had tossed and turned all night, searching for a path that would resolve these tensions. He wanted the world to understand that the Church's mission is anchored in truth, and yet he knew that this truth, if divorced from mercy, risked becoming a lifeless theory that people on the margins might never feel in their hearts. He replayed the moment when Cardinal Robert Sarah had stood up, that quiet yet formidable man, often called the theological anchor of orthodoxy. With measured tones, Sarah had insisted that compassion must never overshadow doctrine. "The Church's mission is salvation, not affirmation," he had said in a voice that resonated across the hall. He looked around at his brother cardinals, speaking of how mercy untempered by truth becomes sugar, not salt, pleasing at first but powerless to preserve. There was a directness in Sarah's approach that Pope Leo XIV had often appreciated. Here was a cardinal unafraid to call sin by its name, reminding everyone that the Church should never tailor its beliefs to appease worldly sentiment. The Pope had never doubted Sarah's sincerity. Yet in that moment, witnessing the cardinal's unwavering conviction, he also sensed a lack of gentleness, a hardness that could close doors instead of opening them. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, sitting across the room, listened with a calm gaze that revealed no rancor. Tagle's empathy for those on the margins was well known in the Vatican. His life story read like a modern reintroduction of the Good Samaritan parable. From the bustling streets of Manila to the slums of countless developing nations, he had embraced a ministry of presence, humility, and listening before speaking. Now, hearing Sarah's words, Tagle stood up quietly, the corners of his eyes betraying a glimmer of sadness. "Doctrine," he had said softly, "must begin with Christ's incarnation and his love for sinners. Without that, we risk building walls instead of bridges." His gentle voice carried a different kind of authority, a call not to discard moral truths, but to ground them firmly in the reality of compassion. "We are asked to carry truth in the arms of mercy," he reminded everyone, "because judgment without love is not of God." Witnessing the back and forth, Pope Leo XIV felt tension spreading throughout the hall. This was more than a typical theological exchange. It was a fracture line running through the Church itself. Some on the conservative side felt that too much accommodation to modern sensibilities diluted doctrine. Others, more progressive, believed that the emphasis on rules over relationships was causing many to feel excluded, especially within LGBTQ communities. As Tagle and Sarah exchanged increasingly pointed remarks, though never descending to insults, it became painfully evident that dialogue alone would not reconcile these diverging perspectives. The ache in Pope Leo XIV's chest grew heavier with each passionate plea, each theological citation, each reference to tradition or to the lived experiences of real people longing for acceptance. When the discussion ended, it left everyone in the room aware that no resolution had been reached. All through that night, Pope Leo XIV had prayed in the private chapel near his sleeping quarters. Candles flickered as he knelt before the tabernacle, wrestling with his conscience and with his responsibility as the Bishop of Rome. The lines etched on his face bespoke the gravity of what he was about to do. By the time dawn arrived, he had made his decision. If truth and mercy could not walk together harmoniously under the oversight of both Sarah and Tagle, then one must step aside from the particular role at stake: pastoral responsibility for the LGBTQ mission of the Church. As his final prayer ended, he rose, walked to his desk, and drafted the formal decree. He was well aware of how monumental this step would be. The world was watching closely to see how the Catholic Church would address issues of sexuality, identity, and belonging. Now, by concentrating the entire responsibility of the LGBTQ mission in one cardinal, Pope Leo XIV was effectively choosing a direction that would shape countless lives. He wanted to believe it was possible to uphold traditional doctrine while exercising a gentle sensitivity toward people who had long felt marginalized. That was why, even as he wrote Cardinal Robert Sarah's name on the parchment, appointing him to lead the Church's pastoral outreach to LGBTQ persons, the Pope added clarifications in his own handwriting, cautions against severity, reminders never to forget the human soul. In the decree, he underlined the words "with fidelity but not with severity," and added a note: doctrine must never silence tears. That morning, in a private audience, he handed Cardinal Tagle the final document. The cardinal read it in silence, and though Pope Leo XIV expected to see at least a flicker of anger or betrayal, he found none. Instead, Tagle's eyes brimmed with sorrowful acceptance. "Fiat, let it be done," the cardinal whispered. With that, Tagle bowed respectfully, signifying his obedience to the Pope's authority, even in deep disagreement. Before leaving, he managed to express the pain he felt for the people who might be hurt by this move. "If mercy no longer has a place in the heart of the Church," he had asked softly, "who will search for the abandoned child? Who will hear the silent cries?" Pope Leo XIV, struggling to keep his voice steady, had no immediate answer. He wanted to say something reassuring, but words failed him. All he could do was grasp Tagle's hands and look into his eyes, silently acknowledging the heartbreak. In the corridor outside that private audience, Tagle found himself standing in the Vatican halls for what might be the last time as an influential voice on this issue. The marble floors glistened under the grand chandeliers, and all around him were the echoes of history, the footfalls of countless saints and popes, the heavy weight of centuries of tradition. Yet, in that moment, Tagle felt none of the grandeur, only the faint sting of tears he tried to keep from falling. He could feel the weight of many who had placed hope in him, hoping he would push for a gentler, more inclusive approach. As he walked toward his quarters to gather a few personal belongings, he repeated Pope Leo XIV's words: "You are not being cast out. You are being sent to the margins, to those who have never doubted God's love." Tagle paused at that memory. It seemed both a blessing and a sorrow. "Then I will go," he murmured, "but I will not be silent." True to his quiet nature, Cardinal Tagle slipped out of the Vatican that very afternoon with minimal fanfare. He carried only a small suitcase and a heart full of questions. Outside the walls of that sovereign city-state, he began a new ministry, choosing to serve among the sick, the homeless, and refugees. It was as though he were returning to the roots of his vocation, the same vantage point from which he had once discovered his calling to the priesthood. Churches and NGOs in the surrounding neighborhoods soon discovered that Cardinal Tagle was offering his help in the simplest tasks: distributing food, cleaning wounds, reading scripture to the elderly, wiping the tears of single mothers who had nowhere else to turn, and sharing laughter with street children. His presence was unobtrusive, quiet, and yet deeply comforting. Word began to spread among volunteers and local parishioners. "The Cardinal is here, not in red robes, but in simple clerical clothes, carrying boxes of supplies, listening to anyone who needs an ear. A few days later, in a refugee camp on the outskirts of the city, a small group of volunteers was busy sorting donated items. Among them was a young woman with a smartphone in hand, capturing moments of daily life to help with fundraising efforts. That day, she happened to notice Cardinal Tagle crouching beside a wounded child who was crying softly. Intrigued, she filmed him as he gently tended to the child's injury, his actions unhurried and tender, as though the rest of the world had fallen away. Then, he gathered a cluster of children around him and began reading from Scripture. He chose passages about healing, about Jesus touching lepers, about God being close to the brokenhearted. In the background, there was no ornate choir or majestic cathedral, only the faint hum of nearby tents and the subdued bustle of families trying to survive another day. The volunteer recorded roughly 5 minutes of this scene, more out of a sense of awe than any deliberate plan. Later that evening, sitting in her tent, she decided to upload the clip to social media. She titled it "Where the Church Still Lives," not expecting more than a handful of her friends to see it. But within hours, the video took on a life of its own, shared first by local communities, then by Catholic groups, then by major news platforms, until it cascaded across the globe. People in every time zone clicked on that shaky footage. No high production values, no camera stabilizers, and found themselves moved to tears by the tenderness they witnessed. Here was a cardinal, once a high-profile figure within the Vatican, now kneeling on dusty ground, offering comfort and hope to a child who had likely never heard of theological debates or doctrinal stances. Comments multiplied at lightning speed. "This is real mercy. I thought the church had forgotten love. Now I remember why I still believe. Tagle is doing what Christ would do." The clip resonated far beyond Catholic circles, touching the hearts of people of diverse faiths or none at all. News outlets quickly picked up the story of Cardinal Tagle's ministry at the margins. International correspondents labeled him the exiled Cardinal of Mercy, though Tagle bristled at the notion of exile. "I haven't been exiled," he told a local journalist. "I'm merely going where I've always been called, to serve. This is not a fall from grace. It's a return to the heart of the gospel." Soon, mainstream networks aired portions of the video, provoking widespread discussion about the future direction of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, social media erupted in campaigns labeled #March of Mercy, where grassroots groups organized prayer vigils and rosary gatherings to pray for unity in the church, to pray for the marginalized, and to express solidarity with Tagle's humble example. These were not protests demanding official changes in doctrine. Rather, they were heartfelt appeals for greater compassion. The sense of a shared spiritual hunger was palpable. People yearned for a church that could combine unwavering truth with a genuine love that met people in their brokenness. Letters poured into the Vatican in unprecedented volumes. Many were from individuals who confessed to having been disillusioned with institutional religion, only to feel reawakened by Tagle's demonstration of practical charity. Others wrote about how they had once scorned Tagle, seeing him as a soft liberal. But after watching the video, they realized that mercy, far from being weak, had an undeniable power to touch souls. Pope Leo XIV, reading through some of the letters, felt both humbled and troubled. He saw that decisions made within the halls of power reverberated far beyond those walls, reaching people in ways that could either heal or harm. He found himself asking, "Have I misunderstood mercy? Did I place the burden of truth on one man's shoulders while dismissing another's gift for empathy?" Meanwhile, Cardinal Robert Sarah found himself in a difficult position. Within hours of the decree, many in the Catholic community had branded him as the man who opposed mercy. In his private office, Sarah sat with a stack of theological documents he had prepared, meticulously crafted arguments that upheld traditional church teaching on sexuality. Yet something felt off as he stared at the reams of paper. A friend had forwarded him the viral video of Tagle. As Sarah watched Tagle kneeling beside that wounded child, he was struck by a wave of introspection. A question from Tagle's message haunted him. Can truth still kneel beside the wounded before telling them what is broken in their lives? Sarah couldn't dismiss the question. He kept playing the clip, noticing Tagle's gentle voice, the children's trusting eyes, the intangible sense of grace surrounding that moment. In Sarah's heart, the certainty he normally prided himself on began to waver, if only slightly, prompting him to ask whether he had sometimes risked turning truth into a fortress that kept some people locked outside. In a quiet move, Sarah locked away the stern press release he had intended to issue, one that would have firmly reiterated the Church's stance on moral issues. He postponed sending out his official statement. "Not today," he murmured, acknowledging in that moment that the path ahead might require more listening than pronouncing. He found himself praying in his private chapel longer than usual, questioning whether defending the structure of orthodoxy at all costs risked losing sight of the wounded souls who needed the gentle reassurance of Christ's love. A single sentence from Tagle's earlier note echoed in his mind. Doctrine should never silence tears. For the first time, Sarah found himself wondering if those tears might hold a truth deeper than words could express. Back in the Apostolic Palace, the aftermath of the viral video left Pope Leo XIV grappling with the realization that his attempt at a decisive resolution had not brought the peace he had hoped. Instead, it had sparked a global conversation about mercy, compassion, and the Church's identity. The Pope began placing mementos on a small altar in his private study. A photograph of Cardinal Tagle surrounded by refugee children, a sprig of olive branch symbolizing both agony and peace, and finally, the child's drawing of a heart and cross that Tagle had received at the camp. Late at night, he would sit before these items and pray, searching for clarity. He kept reading lines from the letters that streamed in daily, many penned by ordinary believers who confessed how they had once felt abandoned by the Church. In those voices, Pope Leo XIV heard an undeniable longing, a longing for a shepherd who would come, not in the name of condemnation, but in the name of love. Tears welled up as he wondered if the Church was experiencing a breaking or a bending back toward its truest path. Time and again, he found himself whispering, "Teach us to kneel again, Lord." Against the advice of some senior advisors who worried about fueling further controversy, Pope Leo XIV made a bold decision. He invited Cardinal Tagle to speak at the conclusion of a Vatican conference on the new evangelization. The announcement stunned many inside the Curia, especially those who believed Tagle's approach risked confusing doctrine. Some whispered that the Pope was attempting to backtrack on his earlier decree. Others quietly hoped this might be a step toward healing the divisions that had surfaced. But the Pope remained opaque about his motives. He simply stated that Tagle's perspective needed to be heard by the entire Church, perhaps now more than ever. When the day of the conference arrived, Vatican City buzzed with anticipation. Over 200 delegates, including bishops, theologians, and lay leaders from around the world, gathered in an ornate hall. Many guessed that Tagle might deliver a stirring call for mercy, especially in the wake of his viral video. But even those who admired him couldn't predict the simplicity and power of the address he was about to give. Tagle entered quietly, eschewing the usual formal vestments for a simple black cassock. He carried only one item in his hands, the child's drawing he had been given at the refugee camp, a roughly sketched heart with a small cross inside it. Stepping up to the microphone, he paused for a few seconds, letting the hush settle. He could feel hundreds of eyes upon him, and he sensed an undercurrent of expectation. Some feared he would lambaste the hierarchy. Others hoped he might propose a grand theological compromise. Instead, he began by sharing a child's question that had haunted him for days. "Father, does God arrive late?" The question had come from a little girl in the camp who had lost her home, asking if God was running behind schedule and helping her family. "I carry this question," Tagle said softly, "because in so many places it feels like we, the Church, the shepherds, arrive too late for the wounded, too late for the voiceless. Even when we arrive, we do so carrying weighty tomes of doctrine and often forget that the person before us might need a simple embrace before they can hear any teaching." His voice was steady but charged with emotion. No one in the hall seemed able to look away. "I do not ask the Church to abandon her truth," he continued. "I ask her to remember her heart, because if we cannot kneel with the wounded before we speak, How will they ever believe we truly love them? He held up the child's drawing for everyone to see. A bright red heart with a single cross in the center. This is my theology now. We can build cathedrals, hold conferences, and write statements. But if we have not love, we are a resounding gong, an echo that fades into nothingness. Christ did not merely preach from a throne. He walked among lepers, touched them, healed them, suffered for them. He fed the hungry, wept at tombs, and welcomed outcasts. Where'd he sit today? On a gilded chair or on a dusty stool in a refugee camp? Listening to a child's pain, his words cut through the crowd like a spiritual lightning bolt. Some cardinals averted their eyes, stirred by an uncomfortable realization. Others felt tears pooling. In that space, there was no dividing line between progressive or conservative, only the sober confrontation with the question, are we too late for those who need us most? After a few more poignant reflections, Tagle's concluding line was simple yet profound. Love is not the soft option, is the only option. He stepped back from the microphone, letting silence envelop the hall. It was as though time froze. No applause, no whispered remarks, just a collective intake of breath. Eventually, the assembled cardinals rose to their feet, one by one, not in a frenzied ovation, but in a gesture of respect that felt almost liturgical. Pope Leo XIV, seated in the front row, was among the first to stand. Tears glistened in his eyes as he walked toward Tagle, embraced him gently, and whispered, "You were never far from my heart." In a gesture that defied protocol, the Pope then addressed the gathering spontaneously. Let it be recorded that the final word of this synod was not power, but mercy. With that, the gravity of the moment settled in. Outside the hall, news of Tagle's speech and the Pope's reaction spread instantly. Journalists scrambled to release breaking news segments, and within hours, Tagle's words, especially his question about whether God arrives late, were trending across global social media platforms. People from all walks of life, devout Catholics, curious onlookers, skeptics, found themselves moved by the authenticity of that message. The child's drawing of the heart and cross became an emblem, shared widely in digital posts, and even made into small posters in some parishes. The short excerpt of Tagle's final line, "Love is not the soft option. It is the only option," was repeated in multiple languages across online forums, echoing like a mantra that captured the essence of his plea. Behind closed doors, Cardinal Sarah absorbed the news of Tagle's speech with a mix of relief and introspection. He had listened to parts of it via a live feed, watching Tagle hold up that child's drawing. Sarah clenched the final draft of his own theological statement in his hands, reading it one last time. The lines remained rigorous and theologically sound, but as he turned the pages, he sensed that something was missing, something intangible that Tagle seemed to carry in spades. Sarah slowly closed the folder, placed it on a shelf, and quietly prayed. He recognized that Tagle's message did not invalidate the importance of doctrine, but insisted that doctrine is fully realized only when expressed through compassion. In that moment, Sarah felt a quiet resolve forming within him to find a way to unite truth and mercy more seamlessly than he had ever considered before. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the Vatican shifted noticeably. Cardinals who had been staunchly divided on doctrinal lines found themselves discussing pastoral approaches in a more open, fraternal manner. Letters of gratitude continued flooding the Holy See, many referencing Tagle's talk or sharing personal testimonies of renewed faith. Ordinary Catholics, touched by the possibility that their church could combine orthodoxy with an outstretched hand, organized prayer groups focusing on acts of mercy, feeding the homeless, visiting prisoners, consoling the sick. Around the world, parishes reported an uptick in confessions, not driven by guilt or fear, but by a yearning to reconnect with a church that seemed to be, in many eyes, rediscovering its heart. Observing these developments, Pope Leo XIV filled pages in his personal journal, reflecting on how a shepherd preached without raising his voice, and the entire church heard him. He wrote about the potential of disruption as God's way of rearranging our pride, and how the church breathes best when she stands beside the poor. One entry read, "Perhaps the church does not need another policy. Perhaps she just needs to remember how to cry again." Some days, he felt a pang of regret that his initial decree had caused pain and confusion. Yet at the same time, he saw how that very act had ignited a deeper conversation. He began to suspect that God had been working through the heartbreak and tension, leading the church into a season of grace that no one had planned or orchestrated. Meanwhile, Cardinal Sarah quietly began revising his approach to the LGBTQ mission he had been entrusted with. He made discreet inquiries into how local ministries were serving LGBTQ individuals, reading stories, and genuinely listening to the testimonies of people who had felt invisible in the eyes of the church. Though Sarah never publicly renounced his doctrinal convictions, those close to him noticed a subtle shift in his tone, a gentler presence, a greater willingness to dialogue. He acknowledged Tagle's perspective comes from love and found himself pondering how to integrate that love into official guidelines. It was a slow, sometimes uneasy process, but the seeds were planted and growth was beginning. Beyond the corridors of power, Cardinal Tagle returned to his work among the marginalized, albeit with heightened visibility now that the world had seen his efforts. He was no longer just a quiet figure kneeling in the dust. He had become an emblem of a compassionate church for millions, both inside and outside Catholicism. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, parishes, and events, but he was reluctant to become a celebrity. Whenever he did speak publicly, he redirected attention to the suffering people he served. "Look at them," he would say, "not me." The church finds its soul when it looks into the eyes of those who suffer. Yet inevitably, word spread of how Tagle was helping set up basic medical clinics or establishing small reading programs for children in impoverished areas. Photographs circulated of him carrying boxes of food, celebrating Mass on makeshift altars, or sitting cross-legged with refugees during a simple meal. Those images resonated with countless believers who felt they had witnessed the gospel made visible. Stories from the ground began to swirl about small miracles and personal transformations. A volunteer recounted how she watched a hardened gangster break down in tears after Tagle listened patiently to his life story, never judging, only offering a consoling hand on his shoulder. A grieving mother who had lost 2 children to a civil war wrote that she found hope again after Tagle prayed with her in silence for nearly an hour, then blessed a small cross she carried. A group of teenagers, once skeptical of religion, started a community outreach program in their local parish, inspired by the Cardinal's example of kneeling Christianity. These narratives spread organically, amplified by social media. It seemed like a new wave of evangelization was emerging, not from grand declarations, but from acts of presence and compassion that cut straight to the heart. The phenomenon was not without critics, of course. Some traditionalists worried that this focus on mercy might blur moral lines, while certain progressives wanted more explicit changes to doctrine. But the general sentiment was one of cautious optimism, a sense that the church was at last turning its gaze outward rather than inward, remembering the needy, the disenfranchised, the lonely. It was a pivot that could not be neatly labeled liberal or conservative. It simply felt Christian. Pope Leo XIV and many of the cardinals recognized that this shift had arrived at a critical juncture, rekindling a spark of faith in people who had grown disillusioned by scandal or by what they perceived as the church's rigidity. As months passed, the synergy between Pope Leo XIV, Cardinal Tagle, and Cardinal Sarah evolved into a fragile but tangible sense of unity. While they did not see eye to eye on every theological matter, they began engaging in private discussions marked by mutual respect and a desire to truly listen. Sarah brought his drafts, Tagle shared experiences from his ministry, and the Pope occasionally invited both men to his private chapel to pray together. Those close to them noted that these meetings were not about forging compromise, but seeking a deeper understanding of how truth and mercy might effectively coexist. A new tone emerged, a spirit of humility, a willingness to be shaped by the real-life encounters that Tagle brought to the table, and an acknowledgement of the depth and importance of the doctrinal heritage that Sarah safeguarded. At the grassroots level, the synergy manifested in small but meaningful ways. Parishes that had previously been divided into conservative and liberal camps reported new collaborations on community outreach projects. Priests and lay leaders organized reflection groups to study the Gospels, focusing on how Jesus balanced truth and compassion in his ministry. Seminarians, the future leaders of the Church, found themselves more engaged in pastoral internships that placed them in hospitals, prisons, or shelters. Many wrote to their bishops that encountering real suffering reshaped their understanding of theology, connecting textbook doctrine to the rawness of human experience. International media continued to follow Cardinal Tagle's journey. Several outlets interviewed him, curious about whether he felt vindicated by the viral response his actions had generated. He responded, almost always, with a quiet shake of his head. "There is no 'I told you so' in Christian service," he would say. "If the Church breathes more freely now, if people are being lifted up, that is God's doing." Journalists who expected sensational soundbites found themselves disarmed by his humility. Many described him as a man who seemed almost indifferent to personal reputation, driven instead by an unwavering desire to embody the mercy he preached. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV continued his late-night reflections, sometimes penning in his journal how the Holy Spirit might use tension and human frailty to open pathways of grace. He admitted in one entry that he had feared a schism when he first made his decree assigning Cardinal Sarah to the LGBTQ mission. But now he was witnessing a movement of the Spirit that defied neat categorization. Another note read, "Discomfort can be a doorway to awakening." Perhaps we needed to be unsettled, so our hearts could learn to bow again. One day, in a quiet and unannounced gesture, Pope Leo XIV traveled beyond Vatican walls to visit the refugee camp where the viral video of Tagle was filmed. Arriving with minimal entourage, he walked through rows of tents until he found the exact spot captured in the footage. Though the cardinal was not there at the time, volunteers recognized the Pope and were astonished by his presence. He spoke with families, asked them about their journeys, and offered blessings. Some wept upon realizing the Pope had come to their makeshift home, not with cameras flashing, but in humble sincerity. Before leaving, Pope Leo XIV knelt on the dusty ground where Tagle had knelt, praying silently. A volunteer who witnessed the moment later posted on social media, "The Pope came here and prayed on the same earth where the children run barefoot." It was like he wanted to step into the scene that changed the Church. It felt real. That evening, the Pope returned to the Vatican, visibly moved. He told an aide, "I wanted to see with my own eyes where Tagle's journey had led him. I realize now it's where Christ himself stands, in the dust and chaos of human suffering." Despite attempts to keep the visit discreet, word inevitably leaked, becoming another sign that the winds of renewal were still blowing. Observers began to speak of a new culture of presence in the Church, a shift from purely institutional mindsets toward genuine engagement with the marginalized. As time rolled on, occasional tensions flared anew. Disputes over specific pastoral guidelines or moral teachings continued, as is inevitable in a global institution as diverse as Catholicism. But the Church as a whole had tasted something transformative. Across social media, in parish gatherings, and in theology classrooms, the refrain kept surfacing. Love is not the soft option, is the only option. Tagle's simple yet powerful line became, for many, a clarifying statement of the Christian vocation. Pope Leo XIV, in a subsequent major address, publicly acknowledged the role Tagle had played in reshaping the Church's consciousness. He stopped short of rescinding the original decree, yet he emphasized that no pastoral mission could be truly effective if it failed to mirror Christ's compassion. In his closing remarks, the Pope spoke of a symphony of truth and mercy, suggesting that each note, doctrine and compassion, must harmonize rather than overpower the other. The audience responded with a lengthy ovation, hinting that a new chapter was indeed unfolding. In the months and years that followed, many historians and theologians looked back on this period as a defining moment, not because of a radical institutional overhaul, but because it catalyzed a collective realization that the Church is most herself when she kneels beside the broken. They noted how the Tagle-Serra tension, once seen as an unbridgeable rift, had led to an unexpected surge of grassroots spiritual energy, as well as a renewed sense of unity, forged through humility. Cardinal Tagle carried on his mission quietly, continuing to serve among the poor and traveling frequently to regions hit by conflict or natural disasters. The global community grew accustomed to seeing him step onto the scene where tragedy struck, not with grand speeches, but with a willingness to sit on the ground, hold someone's hand, and weep with them. Reporters found it nearly impossible to interview him in these scenarios because he remained focused on the people's needs. Nonetheless, pictures snapped from a distance told stories that words could scarcely capture, stories of a church that had rediscovered the healing power of presence. On a cool summer evening, Tagle was back in Rome for a short visit to meet with a group of lay volunteers. He decided to walk through St. Peter's Square, blending in with the crowd as best he could. There, near the steps, he noticed a small group of pilgrims chanting the rosary in different languages. One recognized him and offered a quick bow. Smiling, Tagle asked if he could join. The group formed a circle, and for several minutes, the cardinal prayed alongside ordinary lay people under the twilight sky, the grand basilica looming behind them as a silent witness. A volunteer eventually approached and handed Tagle a candle, saying, "For the children who still wonder if God arrives late." Tagle's eyes filled with tears. He lit the candle and placed it on the ground. In that glowing flame, he saw the reflection of the Church's journey, torn by tension, yet guided by mercy, challenged by doctrine, yet renewed by love. Across the square, Pope Leo XIV was watching from a distance. He had come out for a brief walk, accompanied by only one aide. Seeing Tagle pray with the pilgrims, the Pope felt a surge of gratitude for the cardinal who had once left these walls in sadness but returned in peace. Later in his journal, the Pope wrote, "The Church is not a fortress, it is a living body. If we lock ourselves in defense, we lose the opportunity to be touched by grace." Tagle showed us that love can be both strong and tender, that mercy is not an afterthought, but the heartbeat of our faith. Meanwhile, Cardinal Serra was finalizing a set of pastoral guidelines for the LGBTQ mission. Though still maintaining doctrinal clarity, the language bore unmistakable echoes of compassion, encouraging pastors to listen deeply before speaking, to avoid hurtful or dismissive language, and to remain open to the personal journeys of individuals seeking God's presence in their lives. He wrote in the preamble, "Truth is a lamp that shines brightest when it is carried by loving hands." Many observers sensed Tagle's influence in those words, seeing them as a subtle testament to the possibility of genuine dialogue between seemingly opposing viewpoints. In time, the phrase "learning to kneel again" became a kind of shorthand for the transformation that had taken root. Parish bulletins used it as a theme for Lenten reflections. Youth groups printed it on T-shirts, and theologians composed articles exploring the biblical and doctrinal underpinnings of kneeling as a posture of humility, service, and reverence. Kneeling was no longer seen merely as a liturgical posture. It was interpreted as an invitation to recognize each person's dignity, to share in their sorrows, and to reflect on one's own need for God's mercy. All of this flowed from the day Pope Leo XIV had first watched Tagle and Serra clash in the Sala Clementina, a day that seemed dark and filled with disunity, yet providentially lit a path to deeper renewal. The user-submitted footage of Tagle in a refugee camp had pulled back the curtain on a dimension of the Church that is easily overshadowed by institutional concerns. It reminded the world that despite controversies and internal struggles, the essence of Catholicism, indeed of all Christianity, lies in encounter, in empathy, in the unabashed willingness to love. People across social media, from Europe to Asia, Africa to the Americas, repeated the message that the Church breathes when it remembers the poor. Reflecting on these developments, Pope Leo XIV eventually delivered a homily that many would cite as one of the highlights of his pontificate. Standing in St. Peter's Basilica, with crowds filling the pews and reaching out into the square, he spoke simply. We are not a people of condemnation. We are a people of the cross, where Christ showed that he would rather die than condemn us. So who are we to be slow in love, to hesitate in mercy? If we forget to weep with those who are weeping, we lose the heart of our faith. Yes, the Church needs doctrine. Yes, the Church needs clarity. But above all, the Church needs the compassion of Christ. He concluded by holding up the child's drawing of the heart and cross, the same one Tagle had displayed. If this is all the theology we can muster, then we have enough. Because in the heart and the cross lies everything we need to know. As the congregation responded with standing applause, uncharacteristically prolonged for a papal liturgy, Pope Leo XIV took a step back, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply. In that moment, he felt a peace he had not known since the day he drafted the original decree. It was as though the weight of the tension that had troubled him for so long was finally lifting, replaced by a humble confidence that God was guiding the Church in ways beyond any single individual's design. Journalists covering the event noted that afterward, Pope Leo XIV embraced both Cardinal Sarah and Cardinal Tagle, who were present at the Massachusetts. The images of them standing together, each wearing expressions of respect and mutual understanding, circulated widely. Commentary ranged from speculation about future reforms to simple admiration for what many saw as a rare moment of unity in a fractured world. Meanwhile, the faithful in parishes large and small shared a sense that this was more than just a good photo op, that real transformations in pastoral approach were quietly, steadily taking root. Over time, the Church continued to face new challenges, a swirl of global issues, internal debates, and the ongoing pastoral needs of millions. Yet the lesson learned through this entire journey remained. If the Church forgets to kneel, if it forgets to seek out those on the margins, it forgets its own soul. In charitable outreach, in theology classes, in youth gatherings, the question, does God arrive late, still served as a sobering reminder to be proactive in compassion, to show up in time to be the hands and feet of Christ to those who wait in darkness. For Cardinal Tagle, life went on in a manner that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its day-to-day tasks of service, extraordinary in the global echo that his ministry had awakened. He often received visitors, including young priests or seminarians curious to learn from his example. Without fail, he would point them back to the wounded child, the refugee families, the impoverished communities, reminding them that a theology that remains locked in the library can never truly reflect the incarnate God. Those who expected grandiose statements found a man who preferred to roll up his sleeves and do the work of mercy. I am simply a servant, he would say. Let the Lord do the talking. In sum, the entire episode, from the initial clash in the Sala Clementina, through the Pope's decree, Tagle's departure, the viral video, and the culminating conference speech, became a modern parable of how the Church can confront its own divisions, rediscover a merciful heart, and find unity not by erasing differences, but by transcending them in love. No official document alone could have accomplished this. Rather, it required real-life witness, the stirring of countless believers moved by sincerity, and yes, even a heartbreak that forced everyone to re-examine what it means to be the body of Christ. Looking back, many would say the final word was not any formal pronouncement, but rather that tender, viral moment in a refugee camp, captured on a shaky smartphone, a moment that crystallized what it looks like for the Church to be fully alive. The simple gestures of a cardinal kneeling beside a child and reading words of hope illuminated more than any theological treatise could, provoking a renewed awareness of the power of compassionate presence. And in the hush that followed Tagle's concluding speech, in the tears and prayers that rose worldwide, the Church recognized that true renewal does not arrive with fanfare or force, but through the quiet, irresistible invitation of mercy. Pope Leo XIV would later write in one of his final journal entries, "Mercy comes uninvited sometimes, and yet once it arrives, it will not leave." Perhaps this is how God reforms us, by placing in our midst someone who does not fear to kneel among the broken, who teaches us to do the same. May we never again be too late for those who need Christ's love. And thus, in countless ways large and small, the Church remembered itself, remembered how to shed tears for the suffering, and learned again that bending low is the surest way to rise.